Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Yesterday, I talked about the issue of capital punishment from the standpoint of one person who was allowed to suffer, basically be tortured, for 22 minutes in Alabama before he died. And I did not want to distract my focus away from him and from the problems, the wider problems that his situation indicated, to discuss capital punishment in general. Well, now I will attempt to discuss the subject of capital punishment. If you disagree with me, I'm sorry. I am not a progressive. I never have been a progressive for as long as I have been political, which is since I was 12. I have been a commie. And so my views are not going to conform to those which are commonly held by progressives. I have nothing in principle against capital punishment, nothing against execution, nothing. I think it should be done fairly. I think that people should make sure that the individual who is about to be executed is the real person who committed the crime. Every year in the United States, about 4% of the people that are killed by the government are innocent, or maybe were innocent is more accurate. And I think that that is really, really unacceptable. We need to do a better job. That if we are going to execute somebody, it needs to be based upon solid, and I was going to say irrefutable, but irrefutable is almost impossible because anybody can refute something. So I guess just solid by itself is good. Solid evidence. It needs to be based on solid evidence. The way in which executions are generally carried out in the United States needs to be changed. There is no reason why people should be tortured while they are being executed. None at all. In other words, the punishment is the execution. The punishment is capital. The punishment is not torture. Supposedly, we don't have cruel and unusual punishment here in the US. But that's a lie. Of course we do. For certain people. Now, who do those people generally happen to be? African Americans. Why? There are a number of reasons. One is that police are more likely to search an area which is primarily populated by African Americans than one that is primarily populated by European Americans. For example, and this is not a capital offense, but it illustrates the point. Black people and white people use illegal drugs at about the same rate. And yet African Americans are arrested at a far greater rate than European Americans. Another example, and this was fortunately corrected here in the US. Crack and cocaine are basically the same substance. Crack is a form of cocaine. And yet in the past, in the US, the punishment for using crack was much greater than the punishment for using cocaine. Why? Who are the people who were using cocaine predominantly? The poor, African Americans, and brown people, black and brown people. Who were the people who were using cocaine for the most part? White people. And so after that discrepancy was fortunately recognized by the courts, that was equalized. So there is one area I can point to where steps literally were taken to correct an injustice which existed in the United States. And yet, most of those injustices have not been corrected. The reason why Black Lives Matter was started was because of a recognition that Black people were targeted by the police much more than white people. That has always been the case, going back to slavery. White people have generally been protected by the police. In fact, you could argue that the police are the enforcers of white privilege, and the ones who more than perhaps any other occupation are engaged in the domination, oppression, or discrimination against people of color. So we have a situation which has continued in the US for centuries. It's nothing new. I will give you an example. I believe I gave this example before, but it was a while ago, and it wouldn't hurt repeating anyway. I used to take regular trips to South Carolina to do civil rights work. This was back in the early 1970s, when I was in what was then called junior high school, what would now be called middle school. I became friends with this one guy named Jack, black fellow. Really, really nice guy. Everyone knew who Jack was in town. Whether you liked him or disliked him, didn't matter. Everyone knew who he was. The police knew who he was. Everyone knew Jack. Jack was, I'm not going to say popular, but Jack was famous in that town. He was basically a celebrity. Why? Well, primarily because Jack was not afraid to talk back to white people. That was a dangerous thing to do back then. To an extent, it's still dangerous, but more so back then. People would warn Jack, don't do that. You are risking your life. But Jack had a moral compass, which is why I love the man, and still love him, man, even though he's long departed. Because he was a true hero. A lot of people get called heroes, but they're not really heroes. They're doing things that most people would do in that situation. To me, a hero is somebody who is acting beyond the bounds of what is customary. And certainly that describes Jack. So, one time, and this is, I regret having done this, but it wasn't intentional. I used to go by and see Jack all the time, and one time I knocked on his door. His wife Hattie answered, And I noticed that on the door was what appeared to me to be a Christmas wreath. And so I made a joke, which was not a joke. I thought it was. Till this day, I feel horrible about it. I said, Hattie, celebrating Christmas early this year. This was in the summer. That's when I would take my trips to South Carolina, usually. Sometimes during Christmas break as well, or winter break, but usually in the summer. And I would spend a long time in South Carolina, from Orangeburg to Saluda to Mullins. Those were the three main places I went. So when I made that statement to Hattie looked at me and said, Mark, Jack got shot today. I felt a feeling of terror go up and down my spine when I heard that. All I could say was, I'm sorry, Hattie. I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry. God bless you. I'm really sorry. And then I went home to find out what happened. And it wasn't hard. Jack's attempt to be very much on the same level as white people finally got to him. Jack loved high school basketball. He loved it. He would go all the time, and he would show up early so he would get a seat in the front bleachers. He did that day. A deputy sheriff came up to him, and the police hated Jack. They literally hated him because he did not show what they thought was proper deference to them. And the deputy said, Jack, I want your seat. And Jack, as per his custom, said, Deputy, go find your own seat. That's my impersonation of Jack, which I think is pretty accurate. And the deputy sheriff repeated what he said, and Jack repeated what he said as well. At that point, the deputy pulled out his revolver and shot Jack point blank in the head. Jack was killed instantly. What happened to the deputy? Well, as per custom, or maybe according to the law, he was arrested. He was taken into custody. He spent one night in the county jail. One night. The DA, district attorney, decided, no surprise, not to press charges. The next day, that same deputy sheriff was back on patrol with no consequences. He literally faced no consequences for killing the life of that wonderful man, Jack. At that time, I was not aware of how common that was. I mean, I was a kid. I didn't connect it to Jim Crow, the killings of Black people during slavery. I was too young. I was not aware that those kinds of things that this deputy sheriff did to Jack were happening constantly, especially, but not exclusively, in the South, in the Deep South. I simply didn't know. Later, I discovered that was true. Then even later, Black Lives Matter started, which put the notion of police killing Black people into the kind of, I guess, collective consciousness or collective conscience of Americans. Unfortunately, the publicity was given primarily to Black men, but it's Black women too. It's not only Black men. Black women are also killed regularly by the police. Before police cams became popular and in many cases mandatory, what was commonly done was that the police would kill an unarmed, innocent Black person and then plant a gun on that person and claim that it was self-defense. Literally planting a gun on the Black person and then saying, oh, I had no choice. This person was going to shoot me, even though that person was not. As a result, police generally got away with it. In fact, for a long time in the US, not a single white person was ever prosecuted for killing a Black person for a long time. And even after those prosecutions started to happen in trickles, literally in trickles, the non-prosecution of Black men by police officers continued. And in fact, it continues until this day. The stories have gone away. We don't hear that much about the killing of unarmed Black people in the news anymore. Why? My only guess is that the news media decided that the story had become overused. It was simply talked about too much, and the public simply did not want to hear about it anymore. And so stories, any kind of story, one thing happens and then there's a whole bunch of other stories on the same general topic. But generally, that only lasts for a limited amount of time. And that is true with the killing of unarmed Black people. It is still going on right now in 2024, even though the media does not generally report it anymore. It was only a few years when the media reported it. And there were all these demonstrations. I'm sure most of you remember them. After the killing of a Black person. Riots in some cases, which I think were certainly in that case justifiable. Not more. It's not as if the reason for the riots has gone away. It hasn't. It's just that, well, if you don't know that an innocent person of color, was just killed by a police officer, what will give you the incentive to protest? Nothing. And that is precisely what has happened in the United States. Police killings have gone on unabated. But the news media has simply grown tired of it, or they think that the American public has gone tired of it. Either way, the story is very, very rarely discussed anymore. Very, very rarely discussed. So, am I opposed to capital punishment? In principle, no. But I think that unless and until police officers are treated with in the same way that people of color are now treated, meaning unless there is some type of equity or equality between innocent Black civilians and police officers, some of whom are also Black, by the way, who kill Black civilians. Unless that happens, my answer is no. I do not support capital punishment. That does not mean I oppose it in principle. I think that if we had a good, fair, equitable government in the US, which we clearly do not, in fact, precisely the opposite. But if we did, I would not object to it at all. I would have no problem with it if we were just, if that horrible situation that happened the other day with that guy being tortured, and he was a white guy, for 22 minutes before dying. Until those kinds of situations stop, until police are no longer given special treatment because they are police. I'm not saying that they should be treated more aggressively because they're police, or be treated unfairly, meaning differently because they're police. That's not what I'm saying. Again, I will leave that to another day, how I feel about that. But what I'm saying is that I think that until we reach the time when police are prosecuted for killing people to the same extent that Black people are, no, there should not be capital punishment. That's my feeling. You may disagree with me, and that is fine. But again, I am not a progressive. I never have been. I'm not. I don't like progressivism. I think progressivism often drifts into a kind of fascism. That's not something that I want to see in the country into which I was born. So I'm not a fan of progressivism. I'm not a fan of the right wing, which is also a kind of fascism, maybe even more fascistic. I guess that could be debated. But unless we reach a time, and I say unless because I am not optimistic about it. I wish I could say otherwise, but I'm not. I really am not. But unless we reach a time where cops receive the same type of punishment as people of color now receive, not being excused, not having to sit and wonder, will this police officer be prosecuted? And generally the answer seems to be no, when clearly the answer is yes. in the case of a person of color who commits an act of murder. So no, until there is equity, equality, and justice in the United States, which I have no reason to anticipate, I do not. I honestly do not like my country. I am an anti-American American, I suppose. Now, I certainly don't advocate any kind of violence against people, against police officers, against civilians, whatever. That's not who I'm about. But I do believe that we need to see fairness, simple fairness in this country when it comes to how we treat police relative to how we treat civilians. I am actually going to go one step further and talk about that thing that I just said can wait for another time. Why not? I will go ahead and say it. Since police officers are given a gun by the government and take a pledge, I think that there should be a greater, not a lesser, but a greater burden of proof placed on the police officer than on the civilian. Meaning, I think that the police officer should really be required to prove even more than the average civilian would that the police officer acted justifiably. So I would actually like to see the reverse. I was hesitant to say that, which is why I said that can wait for another time, because I realize that that statement is very controversial. I realize that. And I'm not looking for controversy. I'm really not. I'm not looking for attention. I'm saying what comes from my heart. And that literally comes from my heart. That's what I believe. It's not that I have anything against police officers. I don't, in principle. But I do have something against the fact that people who take a pledge to be fair, to be just, who are given a gun by the government, do not commit atrocious acts of violence. So to me, it is clear. Police officers should be required to show that what they did was required, even more than a civilian would, even more than a civilian. Now, am I optimistic that that will happen? Of course it won't happen. Of course it won't happen. Anybody who thinks that what I said will happen is daydreaming. Of course that won't happen. Police officers are generally loved by the American public. And so even when a police officer is being tried for murder, the chances of that police officer being convicted by the jury are relatively low. Police officers generally do not get convicted because Americans seem to put them on a higher plane and show deference to them. And if after some time of implementing my proposed strategy, which of course in the first world is a pipe dream, the level of prosecutions of police officers and civilians reaches some level of equity, then I can see going to a time when police officers and civilians are treated identically, when police officers are not required to produce a greater burden of proof than the civilian. Again, which is precisely the opposite of the way it is now, when civilians basically are the ones who are required to produce a greater burden of proof. Again, I have nothing against somebody who's a police officer who is honest. Sadly, a lot of them are dishonest. Now, I've known police officers. My neighbor is a retired police officer. He is the president of the Homeowners Association. He is a very nice guy. He is a wonderful person to be president. I hoped that he would be elected president. I had no control over it because it's the board itself, which I'm not on, who elects the president. But I hoped that he would be, and he was. And he is doing a fantastic job. So there you have an example of an ethical cop. And I imagine he was ethical when he was a police sergeant as well. So certainly it is possible for police officers to be ethical. There's no genetic reason, no genetic proclivity to violence or injustice in police officers, as far as I know, although sometimes it may be hard to see that based upon what happens in the United States. But no, of course, there's no genetic proclivity toward violence. But what studies have shown is that the people who are most likely to become police officers are high school bullies. High school bullies are extremely likely to become police officers. And that bullying, unfortunately, occurs mostly in relationship to people of color because they can get away with it, or they think they can get away with it. And usually they have been right. That's the sad part of it. Usually they have been right. So that needs to change. That needs to change. Ideally, what I would like to see is a complete dismantling of police departments as we now know them, and replacing those police departments with community-run, I don't know, public safety boards or something like that, where there will be no more ranks, no sergeants, no, I don't know whatever ranks, captains, whatever. No paramilitary. Right now, police are being given weapons, military weapons, by the US government. All of that would need to come to an end. And the idea of community policing, while certainly better than what we have now, I guess, is not enough. We need to have community-run policing, where the community or the neighborhood actually runs the public safety department. And when somebody is fired for abuse of authority or whatever by the community, democratically by the community, that public safety officer should not have the right of appeal. It should be automatic termination. Now, again, I realize that what I'm saying is controversial. And I have said some things I had not planned to say, because usually I speak off the top of my head. I speak extemporaneously. As you see, I don't use notes at all. I speak as thoughts occur to my mind, and that's it. Nothing more than that. Because that's the way I would lecture when I was a professor. I also did not use notes. Most professors don't use notes, at least not that much. It gets to the point where you know the material so well that you don't need notes. Notes are simply an inconvenience. It's easier talking extemporaneously, improvising. Easier. I know it was easier for me. I tried using notes my first day of teaching back in 1980. It was a complete flop, and I gave it up the next class, and I began speaking extemporaneously. Well, I hope this podcast has been somewhat beneficial, even if you did not agree with me, which is, again, fine. I don't expect people to. I mean, look, I've gone through a lifetime with people generally disagreeing with me. So be it. Such is the life of a communist. Generally, people have disagreed with me on almost everything I've said, especially talking about issues around policing, around minorities, and all that stuff. I have generally been challenged, sometimes very harshly. I have had people yell at me to my face for things I've said. Did that bother me? Sometimes. I don't like being yelled at. But then I would quickly realize who was yelling at me. And I would take it from, well, as the saying goes, from whence it comes. And I would get over that anger, and I would return to myself. So their attempt, or what I assume was their attempt, to unnerve me did not generally work. Did not generally work. This has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.